Hello. In the early days of 40k, the world and its fluff and its lore was not set in stone, and many designers, artists, and writers would come up with lots of different ways to push the boundaries of what exactly the 41st millennium was like. My guest today wrote some of the very first fiction set in the 40k universe, a trilogy of novels about the Inquisitor Draco, and his friends the assassin Malindi and the squat called Grimm. He also wrote one of the first pieces that explored what it was really like to be in the Adeptus Astartes, with his novel Space Marine. We talk about creating literature in a burgeoning, emerging IP, and how things changed as that IP became more formalised and set in stone. And we also talk about his work with Stanley Kubrick, one of the greatest filmmakers in history, and how they together worked on AI, Artificial Intelligence, the film that would eventually be made by Steven Spielberg. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with the author, Ian Watson. Ian, thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to start by just exploring how you first became involved with Games Workshop and their book publishing line.
Well, it was all because of David Pringle, editor of Interzone magazine, which was Britain's leading, and continued for a long time to be Britain's leading science fiction come fantasy story magazine. And Bryan Ansell, as a total boss or an owner of Games Workshop, contacted Pringle and said, hey, you've got all these authors, haven't you? And Pringle said, yes. And Ansell said, well, what I want is real books by real authors set in my 40k domains, not 40k domains, in my different games. Warhammer, thank you very much. Warhammer domains.
Sure.
And Pringle made it happen. In my particular case, I didn't really want to be writing a Warhammer book, as it sounded very bloody and whatnot. So I said, well, I don't think so, really. And then 6 months later, I needed the £10,000 in guaranteed royalties. And I said, okay, I surrender. I'm in. And Pringle said to me, well, there are only 40k left as backgrounds, because all the other buggers had decided to do fantasy and put in generic put Warhammer names into generic fantasy, or there was Dark Future, which has vanished now and been destroyed as just as much as the squats were. So the other lazy lot also disguised their identities, but I read the heap at the time of info and Pringle tested me, and I wrote a short story, and Pringle said, no, Ian, this really won't do. It's too jaunty. You're not taking it seriously enough. And Bryan Ansell from Nottingham sent me an email saying what he felt about the sheer poetry, music, and beauty of the weaponry that was used in 40k, and how I should try to conjure the snick or click or whoosh of a weapon. Presumably, I have the email lying somewhere around. So anyway, verily, I did that, and that was my first story, the one about Grimm the Squat, which appeared in one of the anthologies.
Sure.
And duly encouraged, I was invited to write a novel, being the only person to do so ever, because nobody had ever done 40k before. So I got a few miniatures which my daughter painted, so I could just understand what was going on, and I went for. I was helped by this. I'd always been fond of space opera when I was younger, but I had never thought I would be able to write it myself because I thought I was more serious. When I was at university, I was sort of holding Van Vogt behind my back and holding Beowulf in front of me in a kind of guilty non-harmony. But anyway, I managed to, this got resolved totally by me being able to take advantage of all the huge cosmos of chaos and madness and detail offered to me by Games Workshop. And so I wrote the first novel. Why did I choose to write about an Inquisitor and an assassin? Well, it seemed like a good idea for an adventure novel, which it really was a space opera adventure novel with a kind of outsiders in it. Now, I know that later on, people have a very popular author, forgotten his name at the moment. It's oh dear, he has an Inquisitor.
Would it be Dan Abnett?
Yes, Dan Abnett. Yes, that's
Sure.
absolutely. He has done great things with the ordinary lives of persons in the Warhammer universe, and what is the name of a wine cooler, for example.
Sure.
And I didn't want to do this kind of domestic thing because I did not think of doing it, but I wanted to be outrageous and extensive. So in the way that a space opera writer like Van Vogt was in Voyage of the Space Beagle. I produced Inquisitor, and this was okay. There was no fuss especially about that, imprimatur, let it be printed. And then the GW then Bryan Ansell got thrown overboard into the sea with a concrete collar around his neck, and the new management of leaner and cleaner, Rick Priestley and people, they convened a conference in Nottingham of us Games Workshop authors, because they wanted a collective novel by all of us about the career of a space marine.
Right.
You should always remember that, in general, Warhammer GW earned 90% of their income from 40K, and of that enormous amount, at least when I was paying attention, about 90% of that came from space marine related stuff. Right. So we would have a conference. We would all agree, wooed by canapes and wine, to write a collective novel. And we all said, "Very good idea." I volunteered to write the setting up, which is the background of the three space marines, and everyone else said, "Oh, yes," and send it around, and nobody else did a single thing about it. because they'd got over the wine and the canopies by then. And also it required a hell of a lot of work, finding out about these hive cities like Necromunda and how they function. But Anyway, I said I would continue and write the whole damn thing. And I think people were relieved. So I thought, now how the hell do I convert a small Citadel miniature into an actual person, using person in a generous way?
Sure.
And I, as you may have heard, decided to introduce a homoerotic subtext with regard to what went on in the battle monasteries in a very disciplined way, and for the glory of the emperor, of course.
Sure.
And this would not be totally noticeable to children. But at the time, it was not 12-year-old kids who were the audience. It was goths who were about 20 years old and wore black clothes and studs.
Right.
So this was okay for them. So I wrote the book and sent it to Nottingham. And really quite soon, in fact, two things happened. One of which Nottingham announced, Ian, you are going to have to make a major rewrite of this book to get rid of some things. And at the same time, they quarreled and broke with Brighton and Pringle.
Right.
And there was an interregnum. And when the interregnum ended 9 months later, we had Boxtree book packagers as the new publishers. And GW had forgotten to say that little Ian needs to totally purge his text. Consequently, Boxtree published exactly what I wrote, because I said nothing about doing this either. And I was perfectly pleased and happy with what I did. And I did note that over the many years of it being banned by its own publisher, tattered copies were fetching a fortune on eBay. This did not stop them from publishing my number 2, which was Harlequin, and number 3, Chaos Child. However, already there were sort of publishing problems, because Boxtree enthusiastically wanted to introduce hardback collector's editions, that size, costing more money. And Games Workshop looked a bit disapproving at this, but did not totally express themselves. I went to a games day in Brum, 2 signed copies of the newly produced collector's edition of the second one.
Is it Harlequin, wasn't it?
Harlequin,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. And signed copies. And people were, came up to me and bought lots of copies and were enthusiastic. I do remember one kid from Glasgow who wanted his copy of Space Marine signed. And he said, God, this made me sick when Biff's head was torn off. And he said it was wonderful. So, I had not really misjudged my audience. However, Games Workshop were not amused. And I said to, it was probably Rick Priestley, or somebody else whose name I've forgotten, who came round the stalls. He said, selling any? And I said, I've sold them all. They've gone before all the ones that were here. And he said, oh, really? And walked away. Now, I thought he might have been pleased by the no. The next day, a sale of the collector's edition was banned from all GW shops on the grounds that it was too big to fit onto the shelves.
Right.
The actual reason was that the cost of the thing was high in production related to the cost of the item, compared with big cardboard boxes filled with little plastic sprues. And so they were not going to make as much of a fortune from collector's editions. And they did say to me, never mind, W.H. Smith, sell our titles. And the day after that, W.H. Smith declared that they would not sell any Games Workshop books in a town where there was a Games Workshop shop. So it was a bit paradoxical, I felt. Now, I tried over the ensuing years to approach this matter with a sense of humor. Other people were not. They got shirty about the sort of behavior of GW. But I maintained a kind of Chinese water drip torture, which never existed, until finally, after about 10 years, GW consented to publish Space Marine, hurrah, as a highly priced print on demand, which is still in print on demand, and for which I do receive money. That was one good thing about the whole operation. We gave up our moral rights to the text, but we did receive royalties for everything. Now, giving up moral rights involved such things as GW being, this is the games designers, not Black Library themselves, being able to, for example, change the name of my comic foil, Grimm, from being a robust squat into being boring Grill, the tech priest. Now, this is one of the editions, and they meddled around, and but finally they came back and restored Grimm, because in the interval, the Tyranids had destroyed all the squats, but then the squats rose again from somewhere. So it was all a sort of large comedy, but it did fulfill me as regards space opera.
Yeah, fantastic.
I've stopped talking. You probably have another question.
Well, I mean it's fantastic to hear the story, Ian. I mean, I'm curious, just going back to that early days when you sort of got this sense from David Pringle, what Bryan Ansell was looking for. You mentioned there was like a stack of almost research materials and that kind of stuff. I mean, how much leeway did you have to almost explore and expand the setting versus what was already out there?
I had total leeway, provided that the weapons worked wonderfully and were flashy and made music. I had the first guide, which was Rogue Trader.
Right.
You've read that?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know that is based upon H.G. Wells, do you?
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because H.G. Wells invented wargaming in his home, and he would in 1812 there was not 1812, 1912, a book called Little Wars by Wells was published, and with photographs in it, which were ripped off by Rogue Trader when they came to a set-piece battle. It's called the Battle at Hook's Farm, and it's called, in H.G. Wells, the Battle at the Farm. And the photographs are almost identical. And all the rules derive from this. And Wells took great satisfaction in playing with toys on his large carpet, and also inviting generals and politicians to come and play the game, because they invariably made a total cock-up, proving that a war was absurd and ridiculous, and they were all incompetent at it. So there's an honourable heritage to Games Workshop. I was recently interviewed by some guys in Romania, and one of them pompously said, "How can it be that you, an intellectual, have wrote novels based on a computer game?" And I said, "Harumph." The computer game was preceded by a long and honorable history leading back to H.G. Wells. Heard of him? Hey? But this was not as dramatic as it might have been, because they were using Discord or some other tool of communication, which
drink water.
Oh yes, drink water. Yes, so I'm enormously satisfied with the whole thing. I mean, I hear there have been changes, but I am not licensed to talk about those. Well, I can do, but I only heard about these changes, the introduction of a whole hierarchy of 12-foot tall super being warriors who I myself think make a nonsense of Space Marines and all that they had to endure in their battle monasteries after escaping from their hive worlds.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, color was I was being colourful and lurid, deliberately lurid.
Right.
And to write the books, I essentially hallucinated myself into a state of semi-madness after breakfast time. And then before lunchtime, I would de-hallucinate myself and become ordinary again. It was sort of werewolf type of thing, but in author terms and much more controllable.
What kind of influences were you sort of bringing into that hallucinogenic state? What sort of things were you trying to channel into your interpretation of the 41st millennium?
I was very interested in the chaos gods and the madness that they all wrought, and the demonic possession, essentially, which it is. Which hundreds of millions of persons underwent. And, I was interested in these things, as one would be.
Sure, yeah.
After all, look at history. What else is it but a short record of ultra-violence, madness, dissociated thinking, delusions, exterminations, and that's only the 8,000 years we know about. And
Sure.
Before that, yawns, millennia of evidently empires and massacres and death, which we know nothing about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, it's all completely horrifying. Here we are, and we're just heading towards cataclysm. And it's too late, because we've...
Watson.
No, wait, I must not be negative. I must keep chaps who are younger than me happy. You will multiply fruitfully and do worshipful black things, and your cat is an agent of one of the elder gods.
Sure. I mean, do you think that's so? Obviously, that kind of sort of train of thought. Do you think that's very in keeping with the 40K setting and that kind of sort of, it's a quite dark and grim place? Do you think that's why you got on so well with the 40K universe when you were writing in it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my background really was that I was most interested in French 19th century literature, which was uh, diseased minds like Baudelaire and Rambo, the decadence, and England was so tame compared with what was happening just over the water. The smoking of opium, all of that kind of thing. I mean, I always think that England is epitomized by the chemical castration of wait a minute, computer scientist won the war.
Turing?
Turing, yes, who was punished by the establishment.
Yeah.
Who was seduced, provoked in a public toilet by a police person, which is what they did in those days, and then had to accept chemical castration and the government apologized in Parliament, but fuck that. And fuck the government for that matter.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was the kind of background. It was 19th century decadence, which was setting me alight. Plus exoticism, the kind of interest in Orientalism shown by writers like Flaubert, whom I did read.
Right.
And yes, so
yeah, I mean, there's quite a heady mix of influences going into that, and then to be able to distill those kind of ideas and that kind of sort of view of the world into something that is a space opera, as you say, and to manage to capture the sort of action adventure side of things at the same time is quite a remarkable feat, I think. You know, a few authors have done that.
Thank you. I was lucky. I've been lucky often. When I was a student, I actually wrote a few short novels, and which I stupidly destroyed later on. You know, fits of pride and things like that. One was about children trained, kidnapped by rich people and trained as gladiators on miniature boats on the Oxford Canal.
Right.
And another one, it was actually quite mundane. It was about from the point of view of a pregnant woman. And I knew nothing about pregnant women and had never met any, but I just invented it all. And this book was almost published by Calder, who were publishing all the avant-garde stuff. And thank God it wasn't, because I could have sought a career as a pretentious literary author after that, and given workshops in places.
Sure.
Yeah. Instead of which I went abroad, and so changed my whole worldview pretty much.
Yeah. There was another part of your career that I was curious about and wondered if you'd sort of mind exploring, which was your work with Stanley Kubrick as well.
Yeah, that's all right. Now, I have to say one thing immediately, which is that the world's leading expert on Kubrick, whom you can trust, is an Italian called Filippo Olivieri.
Right.
He was the one who inherited the dark duty of being ghost author for Emilio Fittipaldi as autobiography, My Life with Stanley, because Emilio organized everything at the Castle Kubrick. Now, Emilio writes more slowly than other Kubrick experts. And
Filippo.
Filippo. And he is also Italian. So he gets completely overlooked and ignored, while other experts publish pretentious books full of nonsense.
Right.
Now, Filippo interviewed me twice here in Spain for several days each time. And one thing that he did was he also photographed all the texts that I had faxed to Stanley previously, and the printouts and everything else, which means that he knows much more about what I did, much more closely than anyone else.
Sure.
He has demonstrated to me that everything written by anybody about Kubrick is a lie, but all contains large elements of mendacity caused by either ego or greed. And my own things that I've written about Stanley are also unreliable documents. Now, this was all very interesting and, of course, troubling to me. And interviews with Filippo were more like psychoanalysis sessions, going on for a long time in depth, being recorded. Finally, I've come to the belief that I might have been deluded most of the time that I was at Castle Kubrick, and that there might have been a conspiracy. Well, Filippo says so, to keep me in the dark about important things, such as that Bob Shaw had worked with 18 months or 15 months with Kubrick not long before I did. Now, Bob only let on that he had worked for 6 weeks and could not stand the pressure and strain, but he succeeded in doing this perfectly well. No mention of this. It's as though everybody in the house had been told to delude me and keep me happy and feed me lots of stories of how eccentric Stanley is, to keep up my sense of comedy. This might have been a cunning plan, which would get me to propose things, which in some cases the wheel had already been discovered, but Stanley would sit there and nod and with patience, not telling me the truth.
Right.
And this did ultimately result in a screen story. There is, of course, the 40K side to it,
Sure.
which is that I was doing things with Games Workshop, and Stanley always wanted to know everything about a person he was working with. For example, at the time I was smoking roll-ups, and I would have a complete box of them. And Stanley looked at me when we were working and said, "Can I have one of those?" And so I lit a cigarette for Stanley. Might be the only one he ever smoked. And he said, he smoked it all and then put it out. And he wanted to know how I behaved. And that was basically that.
Right.
And he would ask me what I was reading. Or so, for instance, I had a book called the Capital Punishment and Criminal Prosecution of Animals, which is a fascinating text. And Stanley said, "Oh, I want to read that. Lend it to me, Ian." And I said, "Okay." But he never gave it back. But I have all the books upon Max Ernst, which are much more expensive, that were in Charing Cross Road on a certain day when I happened to mention Max Ernst, causing Stanley to phone to Tony Fruin, elsewhere in the building, and say, Tony, drive into London immediately and buy all the books about Max Ernst that you can find in Zwemmer's and the other art bookshops. And these were duly brought back and given to me so that I could try to go through them all, piled on the floor of Emilio's car, well, Stanley's car, but by then Emilio was using the Porsche to drive me, but I'd been upgraded. Or it was a new toy to keep Ian confused.
Because you were there to work on, ostensibly you were there working on what would become artificial intelligence, right? The Super Toys story.
Yeah, yes.
And that, I mean, obviously that was a long sort of process of development. I mean, do you look back on that fondly as an experience and sort of?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
Time of my life. The thing is, I never believed that there would be any movie. I thought I'd been hired to work in the playroom of a kind of super-powered child with great mental powers. That one or two science fiction stories about this. One who could command anything and cause it to happen. And I just had to play with the toys that were available and which arrived. I mean, for example, have you read my 10,000 words on my website?
Yes, the plumbing Stanley Kubrick.
Plumbing. Well, the anecdotes they're all true,
right?
But to what extent did they happen spontaneously? All of them, or was I guided in a way to experience this particular vision, which worked because, well, first of all, Stanley, after he read my screen story, he said on the phone, I'm despondent, Ian. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Stanley. And he said, yes, I think we should stop working together. And I said, oh, well, all right. He said, I'll tell Warner to send you your last check and God bless you or something like that. It's the only time, I believe, that Stanley has ever spoken to an expelled author in his life. And I never quite believed that either, because 3 months later, the phone rang and Stanley said, hello, Ian, do you remember that thing you wrote for me? And I said, yes, I do remember it, Stanley. And he said, I lost it. And I said, well, it's also on disc. And he said, I wrote over the disc. And I said, Stanley, you told me always write to clean disc. And he said, well, I didn't. Blah, blah, blah. The comedy continued.
Sure.
And fortunately, from my point of view, Spielberg brought back a lot of the things which Stanley had ordered me to exclude, such as the Flesh Fair, the Festival of Destruction of the Robots, blah, blah, blah. And Spielberg must have worked so fast. Or he has a super staff, because there was a lot of stuff to look at. And, he produced a movie real quickly.
How close did that film sort of, was it similar to what you'd been working on when you were working with Kubrick on it, or did it sort of take it in a different direction?
No, it was the same direction.
Right.
Anyway, we got to New York. There was more about the multiple Davids in production in New York. The Gigolo Joe got taken by the cops, and David arrived in the fun fair. That was in one of my versions, or two or three of my versions, and the awakening of David and the illusion of Monica, or the construction of Monica for his last happy day. That was what Stanley wanted, and which I wrote, and which Spielberg filmed faithfully. Mistakes were made because people thought that the sort of silver metal Giacometti robots were aliens, whereas they were just developments from
evolution.
the evolution of robots by themselves. But now it's just, and then they thought that Spielberg was being sentimental, which is nonsense because it's the most bleak, unhappy ending that you can imagine. It was little David and little Teddy alone in the universe where there is no life forever and ever and ever.
Right. Sure, yeah, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but yeah, that's a fair point. You mentioned just briefly there before as well that Kubrick had sort of taken a look at some of the 40K stuff that you were working on. I mean,
he asked what I was doing, and this I showed him. I asked GW to send a portfolio of artwork, which I gave to Stanley to look at. This primarily resulted in Fangorn being taken on as house illustrator, and I would try to find out at conventions from Fangorn what was going on, and he'd say, "Stanley's told me not to talk to you." It was no problem me talking to people because, unlike it seems all others, I never signed any confidentiality agreement because Stanley got so impatient to get on with things. So that's the, and I mean, Stanley did say to me, because I think I showed him my Inquisitor. He said, who knows, Ian, this might be my next movie. And I knew that, and it wouldn't be under any circumstance.
Was that just because I assume he had a lot of projects on the go at any one time and was...
well, he had more balls in the air than people realized, and he tried to keep everything compartmentalized.
Right.
With me, he did talk about the non-Napoleon movie because he had booked the Romanian army to be extras. And this had gone quite far ahead, I think, because I seem to have read somewhere that special clothing and whatnot was all manufactured for the Romanian army. But this did not happen. And Eyes Wide Shut, he had told me about this to the extent that he said you should really read Schnitzler's Träum Novella. And I said, okay, Stanley. This was to see what I thought of things. I didn't particularly react to it, sort of Freudian neurasthenia. Another opening was there was a season of Kieślowski, the Polish film director, who was one of Stanley's favorites. And Stanley requested me to look at one of them, and I didn't like it in the slightest. And so he didn't ever mention it ever again. I don't know to what extent this influenced him. I mean, we, in a separate universe, we could have been eagerly swapping Kieślowski comments during our many hours together.
Sure, yeah. Oh, fantastic. I mean, just thinking back then about your work with the 40K universe, I mean, obviously that has had quite a lasting legacy. I mean, even down to, you mentioned Abnett before. I think he put a dedication to you in one of his more recent novels that brought the Horus Heresy, a decade's worth of fiction, to an end.
I do not know this.
Really?
Yeah, well, I can't. We know Dan Abnett because he has been a guest at our festival here in Spain.
Right.
I did not know about the dedication or the Horus Heresy aspect. No.
Right.
But I'm pleased to hear that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it obviously speaks to your continued presence in the canon, I think, and how many of the ideas and things that you started exploring in your stories have continued to be explored by other authors, even though it's changed so dramatically as a universe. I mean, do you ever reflect on that sort of legacy and the work that you did on those books?
Well, to a limited extent. It is nice to see one's gene seed being amplified. But I wish they would unloose Space Marine into the wider universe and corrupt all those 12-year-old kids who are.
Fantastic. And
I could benefit from some more money from them with regard to sales. But I mean, they're very good as regards royalties.
Right.
They're not so good as regards other aspects. I remember when a bibliographer, science fiction bibliographer in Hungary, sent me an email saying that my Inquisitor books had been published in Hungarian, and a few simple inquiries revealed that these were Copyright Games Workshop, Hungarian translation, Copyright Games Workshop, etc., etc., etc. And so I sent an email to Games Workshop HQ, and they said, "Oh yes, dear, we must have forgotten. Yeah, we're not, we're too chaotic to be dishonest."
I mean, the other thing I just briefly wanted to touch on was that because obviously you're still working. You recently did a press tour, I think, for your most recent story, right? The monster, the mermaid.
Oh yes. Well, I think I've got me lying on my desk. This was published last year in English,
right?
And this just came out recently in Spanish. And the press tour is for the Spanish edition.
Right.
As I've been going around bookshops in different ends of Spain, along with Christina, the missus, who translated it.
Right.
She has not translated much of me because it's not worth her while. But she's the only person capable of translating it.
Right.
Consequently, it is a marvel of Spanish prose, and may be better than the English original. In fact, probably is. And also the edition is a bit bigger, and it's got a bit more in it. And so we go to bookshops, and then we have she interrogates me, or and tells me off whenever I start speaking in Spanish. But I just continue interrupting in Spanish and telling. And I was most recently at the Madrid Book Fair.
Right.
Have you been to Madrid?
I've not, no.
Well, there's a park in the center called the El Retiro, the place where you retire from the bustle of the city. And it's about 1.5 times the size of Hyde Park. But Hyde Park is just flat, empty, and meaningless. And the Retiro is a jungle of huge trees, and it take you half an hour, an hour to walk from one end to the other, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous place. And they have about 200 cabins every year. Put in a 400. It would be even more accurate. So I was put into one of them for 5 slots, and this was all very jolly funny. It was great fun. It was great fun. I sold some books because I rapidly perceived that my book was visible as one book. So I insisted on spreading out the other copies across all the other books so that the gaze of passers-by was locked by that. And so I would call out to them, come, roll up, don't be afraid, and other things. which books were sold that way, which would never have sold, because usually the authors slump in a corner, like some living dead or
Fantastic.
dead, because they don't know what to do. But that was very good. And, we had a wonderful person, a very lively woman organizer, a professional organizer, running the cabin. And she revealed after a while, by accident, that she came from Romania, and I can speak a bit of Romanian, so that gave her a great shock. After that, she was very rapid in covering more and more of other people's books with my book, which she would remove afterwards. But sales were made,
Good.
and fun was had.
Fantastic. I mean, what's the nature of the stories? The monster, the mermaid, and Dr. Mengele.
Mengele. Oh yes. Well, okay. Well, in Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein refuses to make a mate for the monster. Now, the monster is a perfectly civilized, good, well-behaved, ethical monster. And he simply kills a few people to force Frankenstein's attention onto his needs. He's not going around murdering everybody all over the place. So I see a point where the two stories converge on a Scottish island, which does feature in the book. Frankenstein has fled to, and the monster has come to tell him that he's going to target a few more members of his family if he doesn't do the decent thing. And so in this case, Victor Frankenstein agrees. But on the island, there are about 14 villagers who catch herrings, and one woman. She is not allowed to go to sea because that would put a curse upon the boat. And they're very uncivilized, these Scottish fishermen. But fortunately, she is drawn into the sea by a big wave and drowned. So she goes into the graveyard. This provides a female human brain.
Right.
Yes. The other raw materials inevitably have to be found around the island, such as seals and large tunas and whatnot. Right. And so these are all put together, and true to his word, the mermaid and the monster go to hide. Well, it's easy to hide, just walk into the jungles of South America. Right. And they're very, very well made because Frankenstein was a master surgeon. So there they remain in happy seclusion and wedded bliss, if you could call it that, until after the Second World War, the Nazis come to South America, fleeing from justice. And the strangest of these is Josef Mengele, who was the nasty surgeon who experimented upon his prisoners and achieved a kind of mythical status as a kind of Scarlet Pimpernel. They see him here, they see him there, which was all the product of complete stupidity, carelessness, greed, and lies and false news on the part of the world's media, the Mossad, the CIA, the whole lot of them. They're so incompetent. Mengele was in charge of a potato farm, and he had a pack of dogs, yes, and they were all scruffy mongrels that were sticks on legs. This gets romanced into The Boys from Brazil, right, where the genius German doctor has packs of Doberman, and guards with lots of machine pistols and stuff. Complete romanticization of evil. Now, what I really got interested in was the duality of Mengele, because the reality, he was sick, wandering around, and at one stage, his family in Germany made him an agent for their manure spreading equipment, because they were specialists in this. And so he was for 2 years in Brazil, on the door, Joseph Mengele, specialist in shit spreading machinery. And nobody noticed this. Meanwhile, we get the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, for instance, after about 20 years of searching, calling a press conference in, I think, Peru, to declare to the world's press, I have Mengele. He is within 20 miles of here, and I can take him, but I need more money. And so he got more money, and Mengele was never near Peru. This was a kind of heroic in one sense, and completely wretched a person in another sense, versus something called the monster, who is not monstrous at all, but is quite, quite literate. And he and his bride, the mermaid, they pick up a lot or steal a lot of newspapers and other reading matter. So they're cultural up to date. Also, they are ecological forerunners in attempting to preserve the South American rainforests.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what it's about. Mengele thinks he hears a rumor. There is a Tarzan higher up the river. Higher up is a long, long way, and he has seen this Tarzan save a mermaid from an anaconda that was trying to squeeze her. And he sets off up the river to catch the Tarzan and the mermaid, because after the war, people took away Mengele's degrees in medicine and surgery from the University of Vienna and so forth. And if only he can catch and dissect and report upon a Tarzan monster and a mermaid,
right,
and send his report, he will have received professorships from all over the world, because he's nuts.
Right.
So that's what it's about, really.
It sounds fascinating.
And I forgot to mention that when I was 12 years old, I think, I bought a paperback book with a lurid cover of a white explorer confronting a jaguar. It was called Green Hell, and it was set in the jungles of Paraguay. And by 12 years old, I knew all about the plants and animals and everything else of Paraguay. This was just waiting 50 years for the occasion to arise again.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So yeah, a real like life, the work of an entire life, I suppose, in a way. It's sort of building up to it and telling a story.
That's the way to
quite a lot
it.
of things. Yeah.
Yes, buy it. It's it's quite short. It's Newcon Press, and it's a masterpiece. Definitely worth reading.
Yeah. Fantastic. I suppose my final question, Ian, before we go, just quickly, was: were there any stories that you would have written for GW Books given the chance? So you mentioned Warhammer Fantasy, and everyone had sort of stolen the opportunity to write those, or a 40K story that perhaps went unwritten, or do you feel like you actually, you told your stories and that was done?
Well, I did leave the Inquisitor trilogy a little bit open because one of my characters was lost in the Elder Webway. Another one had gone insane, and another one was dead. Now, these are just challenges, rather and opportunities in my mind. But they would not have let me do these on my own, because one of the reasons being that I was not au fait with all the changes in the games and the changes in nomenclature and weapons and everything else, and the single issue focus. So I could never have done it. Right. But I did toy with the idea, but they took my toy away.
Fantastic. Well, Ian, thank you so much for chatting to me. It's been a real pleasure. And yeah, it was just great to hear about your experiences and some of your amazing career.
It's been fun. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
I have enormous gratitude for Ian for taking the time to talk to me about his amazing career and some of the awesome experiences that he has had. Thank you so much, Ian. It was a real pleasure. You can follow Ian's latest exploits by checking out his blog, which I've linked in the description below. He recently went on a press tour across Spain, and it is just a joyous read to follow. I have also linked details of his most recent book, The Monster, the Mermaid, and Dr. Mengele, and you can check that out if you want to find out more about an interesting text. If you want to support more of the work I do here on the channel, then feel free to check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. There are free and paid tiers. I sometimes run giveaways, I sometimes ask for questions for my guests and share exclusive content. I provide regular updates on all of the projects that I'm working on, and hopefully there's lots of other fun stuff there as well. So I would love it if you're able to check it out. I also am incredibly grateful if you are able to like and to comment on and share this video and subscribe to the channel. Those are enormously helpful steps for me and for the entire channel. So thank you very much if you're able to do that. If you would like to listen to my interviews as a podcast, then you are in luck. Just go to your favorite podcast app and search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery, and you will find almost all of my interviews in your feed. Thank you once again to Ian for joining me and talking to me. It was great. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.